Cool. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining in. So glad you could be here for today's webinar. We're about halfway through our series from clinic to COP. This is the health community's call to action for COP30. I'm Grace Kistner on behalf of SONCIEL, the Society of Nurse Scientists, Innovators, Entrepreneurs, and Leaders, in partnership with ANI, the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. I want to thank you again for being here and joining us in our COP30 webinar series. So as the world prepares for COP30, which will be in Belém, Brazil this November, healthcare professionals everywhere are mobilizing around a simple but urgent truth that we know to be true. Climate change is the greatest health challenge of our time, unequivocally, and the health community must lead the call for science-based, equitable climate policies. Well, I guess I could have been sharing about our series here. For today, the conversation will highlight how the broader health sector is organizing what's at stake for COP30 and the unique ways that nurses can amplify our voices from the bedside to the global policy arena. And we want this to be a really, really engaging session. So as you're listening to our speakers, we also want you to think about questions and participate later on in today's session. So as you hear from them, think about how you could think about decisions made at COP30 and how that could impact your community or practice, how nurses can influence the global conversation on climate change, what challenges you face when trying to integrate climate advocacy into your professional role, and what support or resources could make it easier. Later on, we're going to have time for either a joint session or breakout sessions for lots of audience discussion amongst ourselves and our speakers today. We'd love to hear you bring your ideas, questions, lived experiences, everything into the conversation. And so let's get started. And together we can explore how health professionals, especially us as nurses, are shaping the future of climate advocacy and building a healthier, more just world for all. And the first person that we're going to hear from today speaking on this topic is Jess Bigley, Policy Lead of Global Climate and Health Alliance. Jess leads their policy work with a focus on the UNFCCC process and national climate plans. She works to raise the profile of health as a driver of ambitious climate action at COPs and other UN climate processes, and to support the engagement of health community in meetings and written submissions in alignment with the priorities of climate partners. To assess the inclusion of health and clean air considerations in national climate plans, Jess conceptualized and developed the methodology for the Global Climate and Health Alliance's NDC scorecards. She also has contributed to research and analysis from their priorities and has a particular interest in lessons from tobacco control and how these can be drawn on to reduce the influence and health harms of the fossil fuel industry. Jess has over a decade of experience in evidence-based policy and programs for public health and environmental determinants, having previously worked the Lancet Countdown on Climate Health and on Health and Climate Change as Non-Communicable Disease Alliance and the International Diabetes Federation. Jess completed an undergraduate degree in physiological sciences at the University of Oxford and has an MS in health and urban development at the University College London. I will go ahead and stop sharing here and pass it over to you, Jess. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks so much, Grace, and thanks everyone for sharing your time in being here today. I'll only speak for 10 minutes, maybe less, but I'll run through sort of how we've seen the health community, nurses and beyond, show up at COPs in the last decade or so, talk a little bit about how health relates to the UNFCCC negotiations, and then finally talk about options for civil society coordination in the lead up to COP30 and at COP30. So from about 2011 to 2021, there are a series of global climate and health summits outside the COP venue, often on the middle weekend of COP. It can be quite tricky to get a pass to join COP itself, so this was a way for the health community to join on the sidelines. In 2015, we saw health in the text of the Paris Agreement at COP21. Which was sort of a step forward in getting health into the actual agreed texts that come out of UNFCCC processes. Fiji, which was the president of COP23, held a health side event, and they also asked WHO to write a special report on health which was launched at COP24, and there have been two more since. At COP25, there was an art installation with air pollution pods that simulated the air quality in different countries around different cities rather around the world, and that was actually inside the COP venue. Things really started to accelerate around the time of COP26 when there was the first ever WHO pavilion inside the COP venue. The UK and WHO launched the Alliance for Transformative Action on Climate and Health with the COP26 health commitments, and the climate community came together and rallied around the health community came together and rallied around a healthy climate prescription letter that was signed by organizations representing 46 million people with many nurses among them. So many thanks for the support there. At COP27 in Egypt, in addition to the right to health, there was language around the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment in the decision that came out of that COP. At COP28, health really mushroomed, and there was a health day with a ministerial, there was a declaration on climate and health, and there were principles for finance that were launched. And then we really saw an uptick in the ways that parties were talking about health in their interventions. At another meeting that happens, not COP itself, but a key preparatory meeting for COP that happens in June every year called the SBs, the subsidiary body meetings, and this was number 60. In Azerbaijan, there was a Human Development Day that had health as part of it. There was a COP Continuity Coalition on Climate and Health that was launched. And an informal group of countries called the Friends of Climate and Health really started to gain momentum. Health in the negotiations is really important because we've heard WHO talk about the Paris Agreement as a health agreement, as a public health agreement. And we as the health community can really draw the links between what's going on in the negotiations to show what the health case is for ambitious climate action across these different negotiating streams. And then getting ambitious outcomes on these negotiating streams will also help us to protect health. It's not always about getting health specifically mentioned in text. It's about making the health case to government representatives about why all of these climate agreements matter from a health perspective. And I hope that'll get a bit clearer in the next few slides. So on finance, we can really add to the need for sufficient and ambitious climate finance as the health community by talking about how insufficient quantity or quality of finance really has a high health cost. What we saw come out of COP29, where there was a big finance decision that sort of defined the future climate finance landscape over the next several years, called the New Collective Quantified Goal. It was really gravely insufficient for climate and for health, in that developing countries had asked for $1.3 trillion to take the climate action that they needed to protect their people. Developed countries only committed to mobilizing, so not even providing, but mobilizing, which means that it's not just the developed country governments that are providing the finance. It also looks at private sector and other sources of finance, and they're not accountable under the UNFCCC. So it's really developed countries shirking their responsibility by only offering to mobilize 300 billion, not provide 1.3 trillion. If we don't have climate finance, we can't take the climate action that's needed to protect health, and that's both in terms of reducing emissions and making sure that we have resilient health systems and agriculture and sanitation systems as well. We can really add as the health community to narratives around just fossil fuel subsidy reform. So just for context, in 2022, implicit and explicit fossil fuel subsidies totaled 7 trillion. So that's several times higher than 1.3 trillion. Like, the money is there, we're just spending it in completely the wrong places. And part of that 7 trillion in costs is the health harms that we see from that fossil fuel dependence. A lot of the times that we talk about climate finance as the health community, we talk about the need to make sure that that climate finance is directed to the healthcare sector. We need to be quite careful in doing this, because not only does it not help us to make good friends with the climate community and sound like we're out to grab all of their finance and that climate finance is so very stretched as it is, but also we need to be really conscious that if that climate finance is going to the healthcare sector, then it's not going to other sectors, and action in those sectors is also needed to protect and promote health. So if we can talk about using climate finance in a way that maximizes and protects health. So if we're reducing emissions in the transport sector, let's make sure that some of that finance is going towards active transport modes like walking and cycling rather than only to electric cars, because we know that electric cars don't provide the same physical activity and mental health benefits as walking and cycling. So being more nuanced in the way that we talk about and define climate finance for health. Yes, some of it can go to the healthcare sector, but there are other ways in which climate finance can also deliver for health. So clear definitions will be really useful there. On mitigation, health can really help make the economic case for investing in mitigation. We know from a report by Mark and Dyer and all that if, like in some settings, that delivering the emissions reductions needed for the Paris Agreement can actually generate health savings that are greater than the cost of taking the action itself. Health can also be more palatable in some right-wing contexts. We know from colleagues in some country that work on climate change that they're finding it increasingly hard to talk about climate, but they can talk about the health of their peoples. There are air pollution wins across sectors. Sometimes in the UNFCCC space, it can be difficult to talk specifically about the energy sector, but talking about air pollution wins more broadly can sometimes help depolarize the discussion. And pushing back on false solutions. So you might have heard about carbon capture and storage or geoengineering. These aren't proven to work at scale. They also might carry high health harms. And at the end of the day, suggesting that we can rely on any of these solutions at scale just legitimizes the continued expansion of fossil fuel activity and profiteering by fossil fuel industry of the fossil fuels that are being extracted and combusted. So we really need follow-up on the global stocktake, the GST outcome from COP28 in Dubai, where there was a call by parties, by governments, to transition away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable way. If we could implement that, we'd be addressing the biggest cause of climate change and its associated impacts on health, but also the impacts of fossil fuels across the whole life cycle, from fossil fuel extraction through to transport, processing, combustion, and waste management, and the implications that that has for better water quality, better soil quality, and vastly improved air quality. On adaptation, adaptation has been getting more attention in the UNFCCC in recent years. It's been under-addressed historically. If we're going to protect health, we obviously need adaptation in the healthcare sector, but also across other sectors too. There's a theme to what I've been talking about in these last bullets. So we need health in the Baku adaptation roadmap, which was something that came out of COP29 and is still being developed, but we've got really strong allies in the climate community to make sure that we get health in that adaptation roadmap. There are health indicators that are going to be adopted at COP30. It's one of the places where we see health already being talked about explicitly in the UNFCCC negotiations. But as the health community, we really need to make sure that we're not just talking about health indicators, but we're talking about the means of implementation, so the finance and the capacity building, the technology transfer for countries to be able to show progress on those health indicators, because we can have the best health indicators in the world, but if the resources aren't there to deliver the progress, there's not going to be any progress on the indicators. So there'll be a side event and a webinar together with partners in Climate Action Network in September on that, and happy to share more details with anyone that's interested when that information is set. On health in the negotiations, this is my last slide on health in the negotiations. I won't rattle on forever. But health is recognised by the UNFCCC as a non-economic loss and damage. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have a cost. It just means that it's not something that can be traded. It doesn't have an immediate dollar value, but we know that health definitely does cost. There's a real need for health expertise informing future technical guidance, which we hope will happen in 2026, for quantifying health losses and damages, health impacts. Some of this can also be done via the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, which is about technical assistance. Another key stream of work for loss and damage is around finance. You might have heard that at COP27 there was a decision to establish a loss and damage fund As of COP29, there were 0.7% of the funds needed in that loss and damage fund. So we really can't assume that just because there's a fund that there is money in the fund. More wallets don't mean more money. On just transition, there are real health opportunities around just transition. The way that just transition is framed in the UNFCCC, it's about reducing emissions while also building resilience, and it's about justice not only for workers but also for communities. And the ask from the climate community here is that we get the right institutional architecture, for want of a catchier phrase, to make sure that there is coordination that's provided by the UNFCCC Secretariat for countries that want to undertake these transitions, and also that there's technical assistance for that. Having the right institutional architecture is no good if there aren't also solid principles about what just transition is. So that's also something that the climate community is working on. And we're working with them to make sure that health safeguards are reflected in those principles, and that the ways that we're transitioning both maximize health, but also make sure that communities aren't placed at additional risk. One example of that might be the extraction of critical minerals for solar panels or for batteries. And extracting those minerals can cause similar damage to local communities to the extraction of fossil fuels themselves. So we need to not be repeating the same mistakes and make sure that those safeguards are in place. And lastly, on conflict of interest, this isn't a negotiating stream, but it definitely impacts what goes on in the negotiations. We know that there's been really insufficient progress on fossil fuel phase out. We know that there's been insufficient progress on fossil fuel subsidy reform as a source of finance. And a huge part of this is because at COP26, there were 500 representatives from the fossil fuel industry. At COP27, there were 600. And at COP28, there were 2,400. We've got really valuable lessons that we can share from public health spaces, not least in the way that WHO handles engagement by the tobacco industry. So in the WHO Framework for Convention on Tobacco Control, there's a clause that says that the tobacco industry has no business and no right to participate in tobacco control policy making, whether that's at the international or the national level. And by mapping these health precedents and making a health case for the fossil fuel industry to be out of COP, we can really help bolster what our climate allies are calling for. In terms of the run-up to COP30, GCHA facilitates a process to develop recommendations from the health community. We would love your input into those recommendations. I'll put a link in the chat to sign up if you'd like to be involved and get any updates relating to that. We also coordinate outreach to government representatives. It's really important to do this before COP and not just at COP. We put together social media messaging, and just to say that participation in Belém, where COP30 is this year, can be really, really challenging, not just with getting a badge and finding a hotel room, but like the sheer size of the city is really tricky. And there will be lots of ways to engage in COP that don't require actually being in Belém, and would love to hear from anybody on this webinar, either in the lead up to COP or at COP. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was really great. And you had some really great insights and stories for action items. And I hope that people have some questions, but let's just quickly carry along because we have such a big opportunity for questions and discussion later on. So let's bring that all together. And you know, what sticks out for me from what you were talking about was that you hinted at health being a shared value, no matter the audience. And this is why we highlight the importance of nurses' engagement in this conversation. And to be able to engage, we need to understand the other players that are in this COP space. So I appreciate so much the link that we are making here for informed partnerships, and why I'm so excited to invite Elizabeth Johnson next to speak, as she uses her nurse lens to inform her other background in sustainable development of the built environment with multidisciplinary partners across sectors. So Liz Johnson is an assistant professor, College of Nursing, and co-director of the Biomedical Innovation for Research and Development Hub at Montana State University. She's a clinical researcher functioning as this liaison between leading pharmaceutical companies and academic and community adult oncology practices. Prior to her academic appointment at MSU, she was a global early clinical development manager assigned to Amgen Incorporated and was responsible for multinational research compliance with decentralized elements of first in human trials. And she was a dedicated research lab. She has a dedicated research lab as this co-director at the BioRed Hub to examine the health design, examine the design of healthcare delivery systems in rural, frontier, and remote settings, and is the chair of the research community with the International Association of Clinical Research Nurses. So welcome, Liz, and take it away.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I appreciate Grace and Kara very much for the invitation to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, being in Montana. Many of you know that Montana has been a ground zero, if you will, for a lot of the climate discussions and what's happening with climate change. We're seeing it in our backyard, and it's affected everything from land ownership to population. Our water is snowmelt based. So, how does this work with migration of people, policy, health? And environment. So we see all of that meld together. I'm also the president-elect of the Nursing Institute of Healthcare Design, and one of my roles that I celebrate so much is being able to also design our healthcare delivery systems on the physical aspect. This includes the community-based participatory design of products, of novel therapeutics, as well as the buildings by which we deliver care. So I'll be kind of switching tracks now to what do you do when you're kind of in this action paralysis? You know that climate change is happening, and as nurses, we see waste every day. We see all these different policy changes affecting us. What do we do? So I'll be kind of going through the creative ways of how we can co-create these health spaces that both heal people and place. So I always like to start setting intention. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Tim Brown that says, it's not an us versus them or an us on behalf of them, which we see quite a bit, but for a true design thinker to be very agile and to address some of these more complex, multifactorial issues such as climate change, it has to be us with them. But how is that accomplished? Well, we have to start looking at what our framework is. What's our guiding compass, particularly as nurses, our discipline looks for that type of North Star in what's a framework of how to then work from within. To bring up one of the core, components and elements of the UN is that we have this right to freely participate in the cultural life of a community. That includes scientific advancements. Just talked about tech transfer, these ideas, these innovations. Well, that includes also critical appraisal of risk and what it means, not just now, but 5 years and 10 years. And for some cultures and communities where there are situations that are most dire. So maybe there's famine or drought. Sometimes when tomorrow's not guaranteed, 5 years or 10 years or these longer master plans can be very hard to understand. So how do we bring that back into context? Montana State, we've championed this work, particularly for underengaged or never engaged communities. We've created a framework that helps meld a couple different sectors together. The one that we're very focused on right now is the planning, design, and construction industry. So these are the individuals, if you think about general contractors, your architects, your engineers. And the reason for that is that 30% of the materials used in construction is waste. It goes to waste. So we have to think about what that's doing for landfill. And about 70% of that waste is concrete alone. What we're doing is not working. What we're doing is not sustainable. What we're doing is contributing to the change in our landscape, in economies, and also in the durability and sustainability of these communities. We've seen examples of this, for example, with NGOs who maybe have told communities, particularly in Eastern Africa, to build these certain houses and we're going to come back and we're going to put roofs on them or we're going to help use this hydroponic structure to help with water capture for agriculture, but then they don't come back. So now we have shelled facilities, for example. What that does is it not only erodes the landscape, it erodes trust in that community to then engage or work on this or bring it back to priority. So this type of framework is something that we use to help create a common lexicon around an industry that's working very, very fast and is very cost conscious. And then we have the look at meaningful design of healthy environments, which is climate conscious. And then also the community, which is looking at their own sustainability. Particularly in many areas where we have a silvering of the community, older adults, where we have to think about workforce, we have to think about isolation, and we have to think about potential ghost towns. That's something that's happening here in the Intermountain West of the United States very significantly. We have to make sure that this is an iterative cycle. So you can see a lot of what we've said is that communication, trust, and respect are ultimately enveloping what we call meaningful design or that intent of what we're trying to do with a healthcare space. And we have different typical phases of construction around to help these design teams when they're coming in think more intentionally and critically about how they're working with us. This is a nurse-led framework. And the reason why we developed it that way is for many of these communities where climate is affecting them the most, nurses are leading the charge to be that healthcare provider and that stability in a community. With a lot of succession planning becoming a threat, it's not going as successful across different ecosystems in the world. We have to somehow figure out a nice buffer between the healthcare sector and other unstable or adapting types of economic development. And what's that buffer ground? So that's what we're kind of exploring together. At the end of the day, one of the things that we say is that great design is a human right. Michael Murphy of Mass said this a while back, and we feel that rings true because the minute that we ground ourselves in this as part of this framework, then it becomes a question about structural inequity, quite literally, rather than looking at concessions. So the first thing that we'll go through today is placemaking. So what does that mean? Well, it's essentially the planning, design, and construction of community spaces through the participation of residents that results in a sustainable and functional environment, and high emphasis on sustainable and functional. We do this by working from within. I'm providing here just some storytelling from the nursing perspective of how any nurse can do this. The center photo are nurses who had never engaged in design before. And a lot of nurses will think, okay, well, I know about healthcare in my system, but what do you mean I'd have to learn about maybe the architect or engineering perspective? This is a design charrette, which means that it's a design hackathon, if you will, where they had never met architects and engineers from other universities before. And they had 48 hours to design a new hospital. They're on site with a real project and have to come up with the staffing, the financial model, including sustainability planning. This includes from an operational perspective as well as from a built environment or the materials itself. So this is one way that we have started taking nurses who are leaders in their community or getting their schooling or education and then going back to a community that may be under or never engaged about these types of conversations so that they can be strong ambassadors and liaisons when they get back. An example of where this has happened at the professional level is the right-hand photo. This particular company that is based out of the UK, they focus on behavioral health furniture, but work with marine-bound plastic and create anti-tip, anti-ligature, and anti-tuck, so patients cannot hide things inside the furniture. This was designed by nurses and with nurses. So it won something called the Nightingale Award after Florence Nightingale, demonstrating nurses leading change in even some of the other areas of waste, which is typically soft furnishing, as we are trying to distance ourselves from polyurethane and other materials. The left-hand photo is a wonderful materials and sustainability wall that's found in Phoenix, Arizona, that really brought forth when we start trying to think about sustainable materials and how we're using materials in healthcare spaces. It can feel kind of myopic at times. We may not be well aware of what others across the global landscape are using inherently to be sustainable from a durability and economic prudency perspective. So, going to show that there's so much more out there that we should make our nurses aware of and in turn socialize ahead of COP. So, let's talk about then designing care spaces. It's about attention to details and providing that clinician perspective during the process. This can be included, this picture on the left-hand side of the screen is an example where we worked with architecture students to have them familiarize with working with nurses to design buildings. This is one that was rendered from nurses ideating what would be a healthy, sustainable building. This included reclamation of material. This also included use of adaptable furniture that was made from that marine-bound plastic. It included different lighting and air circulation, ventilation plans or mechanical engineering plans that helped save energy not only over time, but actually helped with different tax breaks and incentive plans. So again, looking at helping with organizational buy-in towards climate change. The right-hand side photo is an example of one of the community health clinics that is now popping up throughout Rwanda. This is something where private sector, so that technology transfer, the commercialization, innovation came in along with government and community to help build sustainable nurse-led clinics, particularly around the borders of Rwanda that have been largely in contested or in conflict zones. This was a very progressive approach to highly recognize, I felt for the first time, that nurses not only can be entrepreneurs, but they can also be leaders in conflict mitigation, resolution at community-based levels, and bringing to light sustainability of not only health, but economic development through responsible use of built environment. Um, so some of the things that they did were very innovative, different ventilation techniques on the roof. They also had different rammed earth and other materials that they used, and flexible space use. They had telehealth and all these different things in there. And they've already built about 300 of them. They're supposed to get to 1,000. And it was wonderful to talk to the nurses who were leading these clinics, and hearing how they were doing supply management and all these other constraints that we typically see and how they approached waste. Some other things that we've been doing across research and innovation is also deeply embedding in communities or parts of communities that have not been well represented. This has included rural healthcare revitalization. Here in the United States, just as an example, we have hospital closure rates up to 76% in Hawaii, and it can be 1 in 3 here in my own home state of Montana. When we start looking around in other global ecosystems, there's been changes in funding, either from socialized or government-led healthcare projects, or deferred maintenance. And of these buildings themselves, which not only becomes more costly to the environment, but it also becomes more costly to maintain. So some things that we have been testing for research is pragmatic or ruggedized ways to promote social healthy perspectives around climate change. This has included the use of virtual skylights and windows, redoing quality improvements with how community health needs assessments are conducted, green walls. An example of this is in the photo to your left. These types of mosses can live for up to 20 years. And bringing in those type of biophilic or nature-based elements to remind ourselves what we should be considering as part of our renovation, but also the health benefits of doing so. The virtual skylights and virtual windows have been shown to help with biomimicry in our brains, either as healthcare providers who are in this box, if you will, of a hospital for a very long time for our shifts, as well as our patient to decrease cortisol and other biomarkers and analytes that have been shown to augment essentially our hormones and cause other either metabolic syndrome disorders or other health issues. Looking also at material selection and rammed earth. Rammed earth is a building approach that is common in other parts of the world, but not as common in more healthcare systems such as in the United States. So this is something that we've been very interested in, and Canada has also been leading the charge in utilizing ram earth and hay as another insulator in our walls. So looking at material selection. We have a couple different projects too. One is called Tuara, and this is looking at, again, soft furnishings that can be broken, are thrown away or disposed sometimes as fast as 2 to 3 years. So how do we start looking at, for example, infusion chairs, which take a beating because of how much we clean them with caustic materials, and start looking at rugged or naturalized ways that we use things such as African teak and rosewood and eucalyptus woods that can naturally help us with not only sanitization, but also sealing that wood for not comfort, but also repurpose and reuse. And then the Kind Room project is helping with looking at the children's perspective. Moving along, we look at sustainable futures. So helping also with the mindset for many communities of what tomorrow is. Sometimes tomorrow is an abstract thought. And we have to think about that Maslow's hierarchy of needs when we're talking about sustainability and climate change. So how do we help support the next generation? Some of it is through that technology transfer and getting to that I wonder moment in dreaming. So looking at unipods, for example, in East Africa, that are funded by the UNDP and supported from an infrastructure perspective, working with nonprofits such as African Design Center, which is MASS or UGHE, to have those healthcare providers have more conversations with those that are building the environments to make sure they are congruent with meaningful design for the communities in the long run and start talking about what does tomorrow look like. So in summary, what we have to start thinking about is that we have to choose urgent change. It's a choice. And one of the things that helps do that is through inclusive placemaking. How do we include people in the conversation? And where can nursing be that translator, skilled communicator, and that community organizer to take sometimes these larger complex thoughts and bring it into what does this look like tomorrow, the week after, the month, and the next 5-year plan for our community? Design can always be improved, but the first line of defense against structural inequity and environmental crises is to build belonging, because this only begets better policy. And that's what I have today, and I appreciate your time.
Liz, I'm always inspired so much after every time I listen to you speak. That's really, really cool application of using all of your acumen, but kind of putting health and first and truly nurses leading the charge. You're living that truth. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hopefully, Kara, you're in a place and able to come back on and screen share, but let me know if not.
Yes, I wasn't sure if you wanted to pause like last time.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and let's start with some audience questions. There was so much amazing information that was shared from two perspectives that are kind of colliding beautifully together here under the conversation of leading up to COP. So let's open it up to the audience and welcome everybody who's joined. Thank you for being here.
So thanks for the presentation. I'm all in on what you guys are talking about. But I will admit that I'm quite old. So I take all the old man medicine. I take a alpha blocker, a beta blocker, a blood pressure medicine, a statin. I've had a hip replacement and pacemaker put in, all that old man stuff. And I realized that I have medical privilege. And so when I hear talk about how to involve the healthcare folks around the world in weather and climate, part of me says to myself, well, they're lucky if they can find a nurse in some of those places. They still can't get the health care that I'm privileged to have. So the idea of them spending time on something other than that long line of people out the door and down the street that need health care, I'm not sure how to get it. And even Jess, my son lives in England, so I'm aware of some of the NHS problems and shortage and what have you. So I just wonder about that, how to involve people when they really have a tough road to just do healthcare. Is that coherent as a question? Sort of.
Jess, I think you're prepared to answer or respond.
I was going to say, I think it's about tailoring the options that are available to where individual countries and contexts are at. And like speaking for, Liz can speak much better to the things that she covered, but we need people in high income settings to be able to begin to take those steps. Like it's the duty of high income countries to be reducing emissions. It's the duty of high income countries to be providing finance for climate action to be able to take place. It's not the responsibility of settings that are already struggling to deliver healthcare in any way to reduce their healthcare sector emissions and completely transform the ways that they're delivering care. Like I am based in the UK. My husband actually works for the NHS. He's done work around virtual wards and providing care remotely so that there aren't high emissions associated with travel to and from hospital as much as there would be for when the patient was based in hospital, and patients have the choice to either stay in hospital or to receive care at home and be monitored remotely. So I think, yeah, and also different modes of engagement as well. Like we're not expecting healthcare professionals to attend every single COP. Like that's a huge financial burden and a huge carbon emissions cost as well. So whatever we can do, we do virtually. So yeah, I completely hear your point, and I don't think we should be asking all people everywhere to do the same thing. But I think Liz presented a really great range of options that might be appropriate for different settings as well. But I'll let her speak more to that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Tom, because I just came from Rwanda and Kenya. And the reason why is because we went to go learn from them. Our mortality, for example, our maternal mortality rate in Montana is the same as Limpopo, South Africa. And so we share a lot of similarities. However, there are areas that they already have inherent agency and responsibility that they've already taken. Because as noted, the economic development of that community is largely contingent on the healthcare and the success of the healthcare delivery. It's not always a nurse or a doctor. Sometimes there's midwives, sometimes there's other community members who take that charge and that agency for care. Even in Montana, I have children who live in reservation communities that haven't seen a doctor outside of a telehealth visit. Sometimes it's others who have taken that type of role. What we have seen, though, is enormous success stories with thinking about health differently. So I wouldn't necessarily place all the responsibility or even use the responsibility term, but rather I would say it's a collective agency. So for those of us, for example, we said there are some things that are incredibly well done. For example, in Eastern Africa with rammed earth that we're not successful at. Why is that? How can we help the types of healthcare systems that we see here in the US or here in Canada use rammed earth more or use hay as insulation? What are the drivers or who are the people that we need to talk to make this a good value proposition and case for them? Part of that was to bring them there directly and see the benefits themselves, do the tests, and listen to these nurse entrepreneurs who have been able to not only start businesses in their community by providing healthcare, but also have that ownership and agency in how the environment's built. So I think there's a lot of success stories. I do again agree that there's sometimes where there's immediate crises in the front of your face. We saw all that right now with high bouts of malaria, new challenges with hypertension, for example, in communities that never had to deal with hypertension as much or tracked it. Um, but one thing that we were constantly hearing is that they want to preserve their community. And the one way that they definitely see that is through healthcare delivery. It may not look the same as maybe what we see, but what it does are common denominators that we're all looking for durability, and preservation of culture and community. And one way to do that is to look at how we're building it together. So there's a place where we all can learn from that.
Grace, can I ask a question? My question's kind of directed to Jess. Jess, we briefly met last year at COP. You may or may not remember that. I'm sure you were, I know you were extremely busy, and I saw how the policy group comes together to share what you've been learning. But I wanted to ask, last year at COP, there were, I think, certainly 5 nurses that I know of, most likely less than 10 overall. And while I understand that it is difficult to get to COP and it's very expensive, and the accommodation was difficult in Baku, and I'm sure it would be equally difficult in Belém, as the largest healthcare workforce, we need to strengthen our voice at the highest levels of the UN. And I'm also a Sigma liaison with the UN, and I have opportunity at the UN to speak on occasions, but I certainly have opportunity to participate. At COP, it doesn't feel very much like that. And I wonder how we can increase both the presence and the voice of nursing at forums like that.
Can come in a little bit on that. I definitely don't have all the solutions, and
Oh.
very nice to see you again. I like GCHA runs a sort of badge matching service where anyone that has a pass for COP and isn't able to use it is able to offer that up and look at a list of people that are seeking badges. So if you sign up to the link in the chat that I posted earlier or send that on to anyone that's trying to get to COP, like we do circle badge matching information through that. And in terms of increasing the voice of nurses at COP, like if it's useful to come to capacity building sessions to understand what the negotiations look like before COP, and then again that will be sent out by via the mailing list that I sent the link to, so subscribe. That doesn't solve the problem, but that's 2 things that we're trying to do to improve it.
I thought it was kind of interesting, Charlotte, just to quickly note too that even among some of our conversations with like ministries of health or economic development or technology, nursing was still not considered whatsoever. So we have a long way to go, I think, in general. I'm just wondering too, from your perspective, if I can just kind of ask, since it's nice to see you again, if you've seen any change, kind of being a Sigma liaison with how we're being perceived or thinking or anticipating nursing voice, because we're definitely having to do a pretty heavy ground game, even at particularly country levels.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from a nursing perspective, I think one of the things is that it needs to be on the radar at policy level in each country. And I was glad to see in the State of the World's Nursing report this year that climate change is now in as an area of policy development. But I specifically spoke to the author of the report about the need for nurse leadership, which is why there is a section in there making comment on the role of government chief nursing officers. And I have been a government chief nursing officer, so I understand the difficulties, and it isn't in any way a criticism of them. The difficulty is that the responsibility, the policy responsibility for climate change doesn't sit in health. It usually sits in communities or environment or somewhere. And unless you've got really good health and all policies, the chances are that even the government chief nurse is not involved in discussions at that level. And we have to change that. because when that happens, then the voice of nursing in the country becomes much clearer. So at COP, I doubt that there were any government chief nurses there, for example. So that's an issue that we have. At the UN, it's only Sigma and ICN who have the right to speak at the UN. And again, I think it's something that the profession needs to change. There is no Sigma, I know, is in the process of applying or not Sigma. Sigma is applying for is trying to apply to go to COP so that we can increase our presence at COP. But there are other nursing organisations. There is no presence of nurses in these conversations, except for Sigma and ICN. We're a handful of people. We do our absolute best, but the representation is not there. And I think we have to keep pointy elbows in conversations and in rooms that allow us to engage in the conversation. We have to do that. No one's going to invite us in. And so that's why I, with colleagues on this call, are on a mission to raise awareness of both climate change, the role that nursing has, but also the need to influence policy at the highest levels.
I completely agree. And I am hoping that this webinar series, in partnership with additional nursing organizations, right, kind of starts a trend about how we're talking about this differently and engaging differently and raising awareness for nurses across the board to have the foundational understanding of learning about climate change, which not every nurse talks about or learns about, who the other players are, and who we need to engage with, and then how we develop to become leaders in that policy space as the organizations are taking, level. It's kind of like a top down and bottom up approach simultaneously to increase its engagement, and is what I heard recently, our rightful seats, take our rightful seats at the table. So Kara, I'm going to let you take it away to close us out.
So much. Going to share this last slide to give you a teaser into what's next. Thank you to our two speakers, Liz and Tess. Presentations, very informative, and thank you to everyone for the presentation. I would encourage you to check out, if you aren't familiar already with the work of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and just have that email listed there, as well as Liz's work with her institution. I think really great examples of how nurses can engage, especially with the broader health community. And so thank you again both for sharing your expertise. I wanted to just give you a quick teaser into, so we have 2 remaining sessions in the series. We're going to take a break in August. I know August is a big vacation month, and so want to kind of respect that for folks and realize that we've had a few in a row, and we appreciate the attendance of the participants. So the next, in September 24th at this same time, we're going to hear more about the context on the ground from nurses who are in Brazil, just in terms of, the COP proceeding there, and what are kind of some of the demands or hopes and expectations that nurses from Brazil are looking for. And then we will be in October, well, actually in September, and then we'll talk about a bit more in October. We're going to be launching a social media campaign. We'll have more specifics sent out. We're drafting based on your feedback, how that social media campaign will look like. It'll happen over a time frame, perhaps a month. We're still working on the specifics, but we are looking to have a day of action in the lead up to COP. And so more to come on that. And then lastly, just a reminder, COP30 takes place November 10th, 21st. And we'll be sending a lot of updates from the Alliance for Healthy Environments on our social media. We will, we're expecting to have our representatives there. I know Global Climate and Health Alliance always has representatives there. And their social media is a place to watch as well for updates to their email list. And yeah, we'll be in touch with more information about the next series, and I'll follow up with participants and how you can access the recording. But thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in September.
Right on time. Thank you, everybody. Good to see you. Hope to see you again soon. Have a great August.